All right, this is notes for Module 10, and actually this is the third video notes for Module 10. The first two were about circular flow, so this one is the actual beginning of regular notes. So this unit is, remember, measurement of economic performance. So Module 10 and 11 will be dealing with GDP, 12 and 13 will be dealing with unemployment, and 14 and 15 will be dealing with inflation. All right, so first off, determining GDP. The first thing that I wanted to talk about is that national accounts, or the national income and product accounts, depending upon which one you want to say, is the part of the Bureau of Economic Analysis that is in charge of actually determining GDP. So you should know from the standpoint of who's in charge of this. They're the ones that actually will look at the flow of money between different industries, as well as using the three different ways to determine GDP that I'm going to talk about in this video. So one of the things they will look at is not only GDP for the entire country, but GDP for state by state. So this is the most recent map that I could find. It's GDP by state. It says manufacturing in 2013 industry specialization index. So we're looking at manufacturing, so you can tell that the darker state colors have our higher GDP in manufacturing than the lighter state colors. So obviously you can see that we have a solid blue block right here. So we have Indiana and Ohio and Kentucky and Michigan and even Wisconsin. So it's kind of interesting to be able to look at that. By the way, as an FYI, somebody pointed this out to me. This is not a Newfound Island over here. This, I believe, is the District of Columbia. So that's why it's a pullout. Okay, so circular flow. We talked about in the last two videos about the circular flow. The circular flow is basically simplifying economic activity into this model. Remember, we talked about an economic model simplifies the economy and it makes them assumptions. It's not perfect, but it gives you a very simple picture of what generally happens. So this was a circular flow, the expanded circular flow from your book. You'll notice that it doesn't quite look the same as the one that I drew for you in the last video. The reason being is that I've seen lots of different circular flows where they flip some of the boxes as far as where the factor market and the product market are, or where households and individuals, I call them, and businesses, where those are. They're slightly different as far as that is concerned. I have no idea why this orange arrow is not labeled. I don't know. But it is the same thing. So I did want to make sure I pointed that out to you. Okay, so with the circular flow, all the arrows into each box equal all the arrows going out. So for example, if you remember from the last video, I talked about how the money coming into households, for example, all that income from the factors of production equals all the money going out. So the money going out in taxes, in savings, as well as consumer spending. So, and you can work that for any of the colors up there. The total value of all the arrows going into the product market is also GDP. So in this, for example, in this model, we have government spending, which is the green line, plus consumer spending, which is the purple line, plus this orange one should be labeled investment spending. And then these pink lines are going to be net exports. And so the difference between the exports and the imports. And then on this model, for some reason, they have this black line that says GDP going to firms. So GDP is just adding up our government spending, our consumer spending, our investment spending, and our net exports. So speaking of how to determine GDP. So how do you determine GDP? Well, one of the ways to determine GDP is through what we call the value added method. And the value added method looks at the differences between the sales of a particular item minus each of the input added, each input level. So I have a very, very simple example for you. So we're going to look at this in this lovely, very simple economy. We're talking about producing a sandwich. Okay, so we're looking at each level as this sandwich is being made, how much value is added. So for example, here we start with nothing. Okay, And now we add a person to be able to get everything together. So we add this one person, so the value added is $1. Now we add the wheat, right? So we're going from the person to the wheat, and the value added is again $1 because 2 minus 1 will give us 1. Then we take the wheat and we turn it into flour. So the value added from doing that, 3 minus 2, will again give us 1. Then we have bread, right? We're taking the flour and we're making bread. The value added from that, 4 minus 3, will give us again 1. And then we'll add some, sandwich meats or whatever in between the bread to be able to make a sandwich. And so now we have our sandwich. The value added is 5 minus 4, which is again 1. So the value added method, we're adding that all up together to be able to figure out GDP. So we are looking at, okay, we're added here $1, we added here $1, added here another dollar, another dollar, and another dollar. If you add that all together, 1 plus 2, 3, 4, 5. So our total GDP is $5, which is how much we sold the sandwich for. Okay, and I know you look at that, you're like, that was way too complex for how simple that could be. We could totally look at just what the price of the sandwich was that we actually sold. Yes, that is true. The value added method is just one way to actually determine GDP. So keep in mind that this is one method to use. A second method is going to be using the expenditure approach. The expenditure approach uses what we call aggregate spending. And I believe this will be the first time that we actually have encountered the word aggregate. You will come across aggregate several times throughout the rest of the semester. Aggregate is basically the whole, looking at it as a whole. When we talked about, in the intro, we talked about supply and demand, and we talked about for a particular product. Now, when we talk about aggregate, we're talking about for the country as a whole. So we're not just talking about spending of consumers, we're talking about spending of everybody, okay? So the aggregate spending approach is looking at, the expenditure approach is looking at spending of everyone. So for example, the first thing is consumer spending. And so this is going to be household spending, what individuals are going to actually buy. So what do people spend their money on? Well, this is a graphic looking at where does all our money go. So this is looking at a survey that provides information about the average U.S. consumer and where they spend their annual paycheck. So in the middle you can see that income before taxes is $63,091, and it says average annual expenditure is $49,638. So where does all of that money go? Well, all the stuff on the outside tells you where. So for example, 34.1% is spent on housing, 12.4% is spent on food, 10.8% is spent on insurance, okay? 5.7% is spent on healthcare. You get the picture. But here's the point. The consumer spending is adding all of this up, which equals $49,638, and that is only one aspect of determining GDP. So adding consumer spending to investment spending. So investment spending is going to be including firms and households and anything that they spend on new capital. And remember, what is capital? Remember from the way back in the beginning, capital is anything basically man-made. So capital is going to be, for this case, we're talking about investment spending, anything that will appreciate in value over time. So for example, if you're talking about firms, we can talk about the machinery and equipment that they need to be able to produce their product over time. And the reason this is investment spending is because it's going to increase their capability over time to be able to produce more products. So I have no idea what this piece of machinery is or what it does, but it's a great big piece of machinery that would be an example of investment spending. Another example, houses, new houses particularly. This is investment spending because over time we are obviously hoping that the value of the house will go up over time, which is investment spending for the household. Government spending is the third category for the expenditure approach. So government spending is considered the government consumption and investment. So keep in mind that the government consumption, as they provide things to us, they also consume things. So for example, it could be providing police departments, they need to buy cars for their police officers, providing MREs, meals ready to eat, to the military, and they also have investments themselves. So where does all of our tax dollars go? Well, here's another graphic for you. So 23% of our tax dollars, of one tax dollar, goes to Medicare, Medicaid, other health care. 22% is sent to Social Security, 19% to national defense, 19% to income security or Veterans Affairs, 6% to net interest, so national debt, anyone. 3% is spent on transportation, a whopping 1% on education, and 7% on a bunch of other smaller things. So it gives you an idea of where the government spends their money. So all of that gets added together. And then the last category is net exports. And net exports is going to be the exports minus the imports. So we're looking at how much we actually make from selling some of our stuff overseas, but we also have to subtract how much do we spend on stuff that comes in from overseas. So that's our net exports. Okay, so now when you're looking at this, okay, this is the main way to determine GDP. So I do want you to add to your equations part of your graph the equation GDP equals C, which is consumer spending, plus I, which is investment spending, plus G, which is government spending, plus X, and X is net exports. So C plus G plus I plus X. That is the formula for GDP that I really want you to know. All right, so that said, there is a third way to determine GDP. The third way is what we call the income method. And the income method is when you add up all the money made from the factors of production. So for example, the labor, so how much we're getting paid, people are getting paid in salaries, plus the interest from loans, so how much you get from interest on loans, plus the money made from the land aspect, so renting or selling land, and then plus the money made from, for example, dividends, okay? So those would all be the income method. Now, here's the thing is that the income method is not emphasized as much as the expenditure approach. The expenditure approach is generally the most common, and then the value added method. So really, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on the income method. You do need to know what it is and generally how it works, but that's about it. All right, now as a whole, any of these methods are going to be calculating GDP, and all of them should basically calculate it the same way, but for all of them, there are generally things that are not included in GDP. So those include, for example, intermediate goods. So those goods and services that are being used to provide other things. So for example, this plastic that is being used to provide, to make this computer, it's an intermediate good. Why is it not used to calculate GDP? Well, that plastic is already included in the price of the computer. Okay, so we don't want to count it twice, so we don't count intermediate goods or inputs for that matter. So keep that in mind, is that those are not included. Used goods, things like used cars, are not included. The reason that is because they were already counted once when they were new, and when you go and resell it, it's not anything new. Financial assets, so things like stocks, bonds, those are not included in GDP because if you remember from our circular flow, those are used to actually fund investment spending. So if we count them, if we count the value of stocks and bonds, we're counting it twice because we already counted it as part of investment spending. Lastly, foreign produced goods. Those are not counted as part of GDP because it's called gross domestic product. Okay, we are looking at only things that are produced in our country in a given year. So foreign produced goods don't count because obviously they were produced in another country. All right, in class we will practice using the income method and the expenditure approach. I'm sorry, not the income method, the value added method and the expenditure approach. So we will practice that. But if you have any questions, let me know.